In the summer of 2012, graduating from university felt like a challenge. I had spent 4 years earning a degree, only to find that the job market had nearly dried up. As frustrated as I was about being jobless for the foreseeable future, I found a deep love for backcountry camping and hiking that summer. Growing up near the Appalachian Mountains and graduating from college in eastern Kentucky, I was no stranger to hiking or camping, but that summer it became an escape, almost an obsession. I went on daily hikes and camped under the stars, which really helped my mental health as I worried about my purpose and future. It was June, and the weather was unusually cold, wet, and cloudy. Daytime temperatures barely reached 50 degrees, and at night they dropped below freezing. Despite the cold, I had planned to hike in the Blue Ridge Range that week, and I wasn't about to let the weather change my plans. My route was to hike from Cascade Lake, over Cascade Pass, and down to Upper Clear Lake. Getting to Cascade Lake is tough and requires a four-wheel drive vehicle and some decent driving skills. The road is a narrow path winding through thick forests of pines. The rain made the way slick, but I managed to reach the top with a bit of nerves. I set up camp on the northern shore of the lake and decided to try some fishing. The fishing was miserable. It was freezing and nothing was biting. The best part about bad fishing, though, is that it gives you time to let your mind wander. I sat there, listening to the constant light drizzle, which created a soothing, natural white noise. After some time, my daydreams were interrupted by a low rumble coming from up the canyon. It overpowered the sound of the rain. The rumbling was similar to the distant sound of a diesel engine, but there were no roads beyond where I had camped. No vehicles or machinery could be up that canyon. Maybe it was a plane, I thought, looking up into the clouds. But the sound wasn't coming from above. It wasn't getting closer or farther away. It stayed constant, echoing beyond the lake and up into the canyon. This wasn't a plane, a truck, or a bulldozer. It wasn't outright terrifying, but my hair stood on end. I just sat there, listening until after about 20 minutes, the rumbling stopped, and the only sound left was the rain again. Eventually, I caught a decent-sized fish, cleaned it, and headed back to camp to get ready for dinner. The fish cooked fine, but honestly, I don't like trout. It's edible, but it tastes like mud. I ate as much as I could stand and tossed the rest into the lake. I built up my fire for the night and sat back to enjoy the evening with a bit of whiskey. Night came fast, as the mountain ridges made the sun disappear early, and the rain clouds blocked out the stars. It was really dark. The crackling of the fire and the rain pattering on my tent were comforting, helping me drift off to sleep. I reminded myself I needed to build up the fire one last time before bed. I got up and grabbed an armful of firewood. Away from the crackling fire, I could hear that same rumbling again, this time louder and closer. I had probably had too much whiskey by then, and I was tired and irritated. This noise was ruining my camping trip. Frustrated, I yelled into the night, "Hey, shut up!" As if someone flipped a switch, the rumbling stopped, and so did the rain. My heart skipped a beat. This was no coincidence. There was something out there, something aware of me, something listening, and I wasn't getting a good feeling about it. I threw the logs onto the fire and retreated into my tent, on edge. I just sat there, listening to the fire crackle, to my own fast breathing, and to the stillness of the dark night. Before this, I had felt alone but safe. Now I felt alone and exposed. Beyond the firelight, it seemed like a million unseen eyes were watching me. My nerves started to settle when, suddenly, the rain returned, this time a torrential downpour. I was thankful I'd built up the fire because it would have been extinguished by the rain otherwise. The storm was intense, and I considered retreating to my truck but knew I'd be drenched instantly. That slick, muddy road wasn't a safe option in the dark. Besides, I'd had too much whiskey to drive safely. Feeling unsafe in my flimsy tent, I grabbed what I could, unzipped the flap, and made a run for my truck. By the time I got inside, I was soaked. I locked the door, turned on the heat full blast, and tried to warm up. It was going to be a long, miserable night. I reclined the seat and took deep breaths, trying to calm down. The rain pounded on the roof, and the fire, though still burning brightly, was barely holding its ground. I checked the clock in the truck. It was 1:06 a.m. I blinked. When I opened my eyes again, everything had changed. The rain had stopped. It was foggy and quiet. The once raging campfire was down to glowing embers, and the sky was lightening with the first hints of dawn. My truck clock now read 5:45 a.m. I had lost nearly 5 hours in what felt like a blink. My head throbbed, but I didn't think I had drunk that much to cause this kind of hangover. I turned off the truck and stepped out to assess the damage. My tent was flattened, the poles snapped, and everything was soaked. After putting everything into the truck, I knew my hike over the pass wasn't happening that day. By the time I finished packing up, it was 6:30 a.m., and as I got into the cab, I heard that familiar rumbling again, echoing through the morning fog. Without a second thought, I drove out of there as fast as the muddy road would let me, not once looking in the rearview mirror. I've never been back to Cascade Lake, and I don't plan to. A couple of years ago, my partner and I, having hiked several sections of different trails, decided to explore the southern part of the Virginia Trail. This stretch runs about 160 miles through 2 national forests, beginning in one county and ending in another. It's known for being more secluded, which was exactly what we wanted. We gathered our supplies and headed to the start of the Virginia Creeper Trail to begin our adventure. Our plan was to finish in a small town, where we'd be more than ready to return home and sleep in our own beds. It was early October, and the leaves were changing, making for stunning scenery. The air was cool and crisp, perfect for hiking. Most of the journey was uneventful, but the last few nights got strange. On this part of the trail, you're supposed to camp along the path or at designated shelters. But we wanted some privacy and didn't want anyone stumbling upon us in the middle of the night, so we chose our own spot a bit off the trail. After some searching, we found a small clearing, set up camp, cooked, chatted, and went to sleep. Around 2 a.m., I was shaken awake by my partner, who whispered that she heard footsteps around the tent. She said it sounded like someone was dragging something sharp around the outside. While hiking, I usually carry a firearm, just in case we encounter danger in remote areas. I grabbed my gun and we listened silently. For a few minutes, all we heard was the wind through the trees. Then I heard it, a snap, crunch, snap. Something or someone was moving in the woods behind our tent. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly exited the tent. The fire had gone out, and it was almost pitch dark except for the moonlight. I told my partner to stay put while I checked it out. I waited a few moments before turning on the flashlight to avoid revealing my position. After some silence, I heard another snap and turned on the light. I thought I saw movement behind a tree, so I yelled out, warning whoever it was that I was armed. As I slowly approached the spot, I suddenly heard something running off in the woods from another direction. Whatever it was had taken off. I returned to the campsite, told my partner what happened, and stayed up on guard until morning. The next day, I found a boot print in the soft ground near our tent. It wasn't ours, which confirmed someone had been there. I didn't mention it to her because I didn't want to scare her even more. We still had 2 days left, so we hiked faster than usual, trying to cover as much ground as possible. That night, we camped near a cliff, where no one could sneak up on us from behind. The whole day, I had the unsettling feeling that we were being followed. I hadn't seen anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling. We set up camp, ate, and retreated into the tent. I gave my partner my smaller gun and kept my main one nearby, assuring her I'd be sleeping lightly. After a while, She fell asleep, but I stayed awake, listening to the forest. I was on high alert for hours until exhaustion finally overtook me. I woke up to the sound of someone rustling through our things outside. I grabbed my gun and gently woke my partner, telling her to be quiet. In the faint glow of the dying fire, I saw a silhouette outside the tent. I shouted a warning, and they immediately ran off. I rushed out of the tent, gun in hand, and saw our belongings scattered around. They had gone through quite a bit. I walked to the edge of the nearby creek and saw a light flickering, probably a lantern. Then I saw 3 more lights appear on the other side of the woods. I told my partner to start packing up, and we left immediately, leaving behind our tent and some other items. As we hiked in the dark, I kept hearing voices and the sound of branches snapping in the woods. It was nerve-wracking, especially since we were still a long way from civilization. As dawn was breaking, we rounded a corner, and I looked back to see a figure step onto the trail. They just stood there watching us. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark silhouette. I shouted, asking who they were and what they wanted, but they didn't respond. After a moment, they turned and walked back into the woods. We picked up the pace and didn't stop until we reached the trailhead where our car was parked. We were exhausted but relieved. We left the Virginia woods, thankful we hadn't encountered any real danger. I still don't know who those people were or what they wanted, and I don't plan to find out. This is a story my dad has shared with me multiple times. My father is a logger, and he operates a large tree-cutting machine that can bring down massive trees and cut them into specific lengths. Because of his job, he spends a lot of time alone in the remote woods. In his crew, my dad was given locations to work at, and he would head there to cut down trees. He got paid based on how many trees he cut, not how long it took. To finish faster, he worked 16 to 20-hour shifts regularly. Once he finished cutting, the rest of the crew would come in, clean up the trees, and haul them to the mill. About half of the time, my dad worked by himself. The other half, he worked with a fellow operator named Ron. They communicated through radios whenever they were working together, which becomes important later. One time, my dad and Ron were sent to a new job site, and after about 10 days, things started to get strange. They kept hearing odd, broken chatter on their radios. No matter which radio channel they switched to, the strange noise seemed to follow them as they moved deeper into the mountains. As they got further along, the sounds from the radio became clearer, though they couldn't make out full sentences. Both my dad and Ron agreed that something wasn't right. They also started to find strange containers and evidence that someone else had been in the area. This was a very remote location, nearly a 3-hour drive up the mountain. They had spent 3 weeks clearing roads just so their trucks and equipment could make it to the site. It became clear to them that there were people around who shouldn't have been there. The worst part, they were stuck for another week or so before they could leave, only going down the mountain occasionally to refuel their machines and buy supplies. One day, Ron came across a tent and called my dad over. They decided to investigate and found a single sleeping bag and a duffel bag inside. What they found in the bag was disturbing. Several pairs of children's underwear, along with rope, duct tape, and drawings of children, as well as photos of kids who seemed unaware they were being watched. There was also a small amount of food, including canned goods and an apple. The apple was fresh, indicating someone had been at the tent recently. They were now stuck on the mountain, isolated, and possibly dealing with a dangerous individual. Ron wanted to leave immediately, but my dad, always determined to finish his work, insisted they complete the job before leaving. They agreed to only use their radios in emergencies and see if they could hear more from the mysterious voices. As they worked, they were close enough to hear conversations between 2 men on the radio. They talked about gathering water and firewood, which seemed normal, except these men clearly didn't belong there, and the tent they found was likely theirs. At the end of one workday, My dad overheard the men discussing gathering brush for a fire. He got on the radio and tried to contact them, asking, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" After that, the men went silent and never spoke on the radio again. That night, Ron woke my dad up, whispering that someone was outside. The first thing my dad noticed when he woke up was the sound of quiet footsteps outside their camper. He fumbled around for his gun but realized it wasn't loaded, and he had no idea where his bullets were. Ron had no weapon, and calling the police was pointless due to how far they were from any town. Then, they heard the door handle rattle, and the door opened. Their camper was high off the ground with no ladder or steps, so someone had to climb up. The door stayed open, but neither my dad nor Ron moved. After a few minutes, they heard scratching right outside the door. For long minutes passed before my dad, unable to take it anymore, nodded to Ron. He quietly got up and approached the door. Just as he reached it, he was slashed across the face from his right eye to his left cheek. He fell out of the camper, hitting the ground hard. A man with a knife jumped on top of him. Another man came up from behind and started kicking him in the head. Ron quickly jumped out of the camper and fought off the attacker. My dad got up, and the second man, the one without the knife, started to run away. The man with the knife scrambled to his feet and took off after his accomplice. My dad and Ron jumped into their truck and drove to the nearest hospital to get my dad's wound treated. They reported the attack to the authorities. Both of them quit their jobs afterward. About 2 weeks later, while the rest of the logging crew was finishing up at the job site, one worker was found bound, gagged, murdered, and dumped into a ditch. As far as my dad knows, no one was ever caught for those crimes. To this day, my dad can barely see out of his right eye. His pupil is distorted, resembling a cat's eye more than a human's, and he suffers from severe PTSD from the event. He hasn't had a good night's sleep since that day. I'm a 31-year-old woman from Phoenix. 2 years ago, my partner and I, as we'd planned for years, hit 29, sold all our belongings, including my car, took his SUV, and set off to explore the US and Canada. You could call us adventurers because we often seek pleasant weather, find a national park, and hike into the wilderness for days at a time. My sister jokes that we're modern-day nomads. We're not totally off the grid, but between us, we share one prepaid phone, mostly for emergencies and staying in touch with family, and one laptop I use for work. I'm a freelance writer and content creator, mostly writing dull reports for a tech company. The main goal of our lifestyle is to live without debt and minimize bills. We use free Wi-Fi, so once or twice a week, we go into a city with a coffee shop to connect. We don't use social media much. We barely know how Reddit or Instagram work, and we avoid most apps. Last summer, we decided to do some hiking in Missouri. It's not a state many hikers talk about, but we read it had stunning landscapes, and it does. The park we chose had relaxed rules. We didn't need a permit, and there were just a few basic guidelines, no check-ins required. We were ready with all the essentials for a 6-day hike, 3 days in and 3 days out. Throughout the trip, we didn't encounter a single person. One evening, as we prepared to leave the trail and find a spot to camp before sunset, we saw a faint path, probably an animal trail, and followed it for about half a mile. That's when we stumbled upon a green 2-person tent, almost hidden in the foliage. Some hikers like their privacy. Others, like us, enjoy the social aspect of camping, swapping stories, or sharing meals. From about 30 yards away, my partner called out a greeting. No response, no movement. We assumed whoever was in the tent either wasn't around or didn't want to be disturbed, so we headed in a different direction to give them space. We didn't hear a peep. The next morning, we forgot all about the tent as we continued our hike. It wasn't until the 5th day on our way back that we came across the same tent again. This time, the tent flap was open. My partner called out again, but still no answer. He wanted to check it out, thinking something was wrong, but I wasn't keen on the idea. I'd heard enough stories from other hikers about reclusive folks who don't appreciate visitors, and some of them are armed. But my partner reassured me, saying we could always offer a peace offering like some food and move on. As we got closer, a horrific smell hit us, like something had died. My partner had been calling out as we approached, but when the stench reached him, he stopped and turned to me, asking, "What if we find a body?" My skin crawled. I had never seen a dead body before and didn't want to. The closer we got, the stronger the smell became, and I was sure we'd find a corpse. What we found was far worse. Outside the tent were severed animal legs, 4 of them, buzzing with flies. It looked like they had been cut partway, then torn off. Inside the tent was the rest of the deer, but the middle portion was wrapped in a blue blanket, soaked with blood. It was lying on its side, facing the tent opening. Its tail was missing, and its private areas were covered in dried blood, gaping as though something had been done to it. Its mouth was in the same state. The lower body was twisted at a disturbing angle. We could see all of this without going into the tent, which we wouldn't have done anyway because the smell was unbearable. Nearby was a nearly empty bottle of baby oil and a dirty kitchen towel. That was it. I started crying and begged my partner to leave. He just muttered, "What the?" We turned and ran back to the trail, jogging until it got too dark to continue. We didn't go far, but neither of us slept that night. We didn't light a fire or use any lights, even after it got completely dark. We just whispered to each other, going over what we had just seen, every little sound startling us. I kept imagining that whoever had done this would come back, find our tracks, and follow us. I had never been so terrified in my life. At the crack of dawn, we packed up and headed out. On the way out of the park, we stopped at the ranger station to report what we had found. The ranger, a guy about our age, looked visibly shaken as we told him the story. He took down the details, and my partner showed him on a map where the tent was located. The ranger asked if we knew how the deer had been killed, and it dawned on us that we hadn't even thought about it. We had assumed it had been shot, but with the blanket, we hadn't actually seen any wound. Since that experience, we've shortened our hikes to no more than 4 days, and we're much more cautious about approaching other campsites. We've also never gone near an unattended tent again. This story is about a troubling experience I had while camping by the ocean one summer with my partner. We had thought it would be a great idea to camp on the beach instead of staying at a hotel, since I had always wanted to sleep with the sound of waves crashing on the shore, gaze at the night sky, and live this experience at least once in my life. We planned to stay in the tent for about a week. The location had public restrooms with showers and food stands, so hygiene and meals weren't a concern. We brought everything we thought we'd need for the trip, like a small 2-person tent with blackout fabric so the sunlight wouldn't wake us early, an inflatable bed, a first aid kit, lanterns for inside the tent, and other essentials. The first few nights were without any problems, and we enjoyed every moment of it. We always carried our valuables in our backpacks, just in case something happened to our tent. We weren't the only ones camping in that spot either. There were plenty of others, individual campers, couples, and even families, but not everyone acted well. Some of the campers got loud at night with people partying, playing music, drinking too much, and even using drugs. We didn't mind since no one was causing any real trouble during the first few days. One night, we stayed out a bit later than usual, maybe around 1 a.m., walking through the lively streets, watching street performers, grabbing some food, and just enjoying the atmosphere. We stopped at one performer who had a crowd around him. It wasn't long before we realized the crowd wasn't watching him, though. In the middle of the street, where cars occasionally passed by, was a middle-aged woman dancing completely naked, clearly out of control from drinking and drug use. She wasn't making much sense. randomly flirting with people and exposing herself, much to the discomfort of the musician and the people passing by. We didn't stay long and decided to head back to our tent. While walking back, we heard some woman yelling in the distance. It was the same woman from earlier, but now she was with a group of friends, and they were heading to camp near us, just a few tents down. Though it was dark, we could still see them and hear them. They started a fire on the beach, drinking, smoking, and dancing around it. The woman was still naked, but had now put on a see-through skirt. She went into the ocean for what felt like ages, and I remember thinking how she wasn't freezing since the water was so cold. My boyfriend and I decided to just ignore them, as we didn't want to get involved. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us, though. Eventually, we tried to fall asleep. It was a warm night, so we didn't fully close the tent. Just zipped up the mosquito netting to let some air in while keeping the bugs out. I thought the morning sun would wake us up early. I'm not sure how long I had been asleep when I woke up to the sound of footsteps walking around our tent and a soft, female voice humming a tune. The tent wasn't very thick, so I could hear everything clearly. I was too scared to move or even look outside, afraid to let the person know I was awake. I just lay there, staring through the mosquito net. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped right above my head, and I heard a voice whisper, "Don't be scared. I just want to sing you a lullaby." The footsteps continued circling the tent. I saw her feet pass in front of the tent, and I noticed the familiar long, see-through skirt blowing in the breeze. The next morning, we packed up our things and moved our tent to a different spot on the beach, further away from that woman and her group. In the summer of 2009, something unforgettable happened. Growing up in Washington, I was no stranger to the outdoors, having loved it since childhood. My favorite activity was hiking, particularly in remote and dangerous areas. The health benefits were nice, but I was more drawn to the excitement of hiking near steep cliffs and knowing I was in areas with wild animals like cougars and bears, far from any help. After watching Into the Wild when it came out in 2008, I became obsessed. As a high school senior, I was ready to leave home, and the movie only fueled my desire for adventure. It inspired me to hike the Washington portion of the Pacific Crest Trail after I graduated. I started from the Mexican border, made it to Northern California without any major issues. Just some rattlesnakes, bears, and mild dehydration, but nothing too scary. One day, while hiking through Lassen National Forest in Northern California, I rounded a corner and was surprised to see two people sitting on a rock, dressed in mostly white. Their faces were dirty, and they looked unkempt. The man had a messy beard, and both seemed to be in their late 30s. Their appearance was startling, like something was off about them. What really struck me was that I hadn't seen anyone for days, and suddenly, here were these two people. I greeted them, but they didn't respond, just stared at me as I walked by. That night, I camped a short distance off the trail, following the usual precautions for bears by hanging my leftover food from a tree. The next morning, I noticed the food was gone. I initially thought it was a bear, but after looking around, I didn't find any bear tracks, just boot prints. Two sets of footprints circled my campsite, and one led directly to where my food had been hanging. My mind immediately went to the two strangers I had passed the day before. Realizing they might have taken my food, I packed up quickly and left, unsettled but telling myself they were probably just hungry. If they had wanted to harm me, they would have done more than take my food. Right? A few days went by and I started to relax again. As a precaution, I began surrounding my campsite with sticks to wake me if anyone or anything approached. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of those sticks cracking. Grabbing my knife, I tried to calm myself, thinking it was probably an animal. But then I heard whispering. It was hard to tell where the voices were coming from, and being deep in the forest, every sound played tricks on me. I considered shouting, pretending I had a weapon, but instead, I stayed quiet to keep the element of surprise. I could hear footsteps circling my tent, but suddenly, everything stopped. No more whispers, no more footsteps. I stayed awake until dawn, but when I finally emerged from my tent, there was no sign of anyone, except for more boot prints. Several days later, I was in Shasta National Forest, far from where I first encountered the strange couple. The trail had become narrow and rugged, and I could see miles of it stretching ahead and behind me. Stopping for water, I noticed two figures far off in the distance, just tiny dots on the trail behind me. Something clicked in my mind, and I thought, this is over. I immediately pulled out my map and found the nearest town, Castella, about 20 miles away. Determined to get there as fast as I could, I hiked late into the night, finally setting up camp far off the trail, hoping I wouldn't be found. I couldn't sleep, every little noise keeping me on edge. Then I heard the sounds again, the footsteps, the whispering, and sticks breaking. The sounds were much louder now, and I knew they were close. I thought, this is really happening. Suddenly, a flashlight lit up my tent, then quickly went dark. Grabbing my knife, I unzipped my tent and ran into the darkness, screaming nonsense to scare them off. I could hear footsteps coming toward me, and in the corner of my vision, I saw a figure moving. I ran deeper into the forest, tripping and falling several times before finally tumbling next to a fallen tree. I crawled underneath it and stayed completely still for hours. I could see the flashlight moving around in the distance, but eventually it disappeared. I stayed hidden until morning, when the birds started chirping. I made my way back to the trail, abandoning my campsite, and hiked to Castella. Once there, I hitchhiked to the nearby town of Mount Shasta and told the police and forest rangers everything. They were kind enough to put me up in a motel, and the next day my parents drove down to pick me up. Months later, I followed up with the authorities. They told me there had been other reports of stolen supplies in the area, but no one else had experienced anything like what I went through. As far as I know, they never caught that strange couple. Last summer, my partner and I went camping at a nature reserve somewhere in Virginia. I don't recall the exact name, but it was very remote, no cell service, and we only saw two other people the whole time. The place was vast and mostly deserted. Right away, my partner felt uneasy about those two people. I'm not sure if they had anything to do with what happened later, but I'll describe them. The first person was a woman who had her truck parked just off the trail with the hood popped open. I'm not someone who notices things like that, but my partner thought she looked like she was waiting for someone to stop and help her. Normally, he'd offer to call for assistance, but he said she made him feel uneasy, so he didn't want to engage. The second person was a man who kept driving by our campsite slowly while we were setting up. He passed by a couple of times, and though I hadn't paid much attention, my partner definitely noticed. But the strange part happened later that night. Around 3 a.m., we were jolted awake by a loud sound. I can't quite describe it or compare it to anything, but my partner said it was like the sound of a large machine starting up or a tool grinding gravel. He jumped up and looked out of the tent's small window, hearing the sound again and again, each time growing closer. I was terrified, but he assured me it was likely miles away, and I believed him. Loud noises do carry far, after all. However, later he admitted that he said that just to keep me calm. In truth, it sounded much closer to him, like it was right down the dirt road near our camp. He suspected at one point that whatever it was had come right in front of our site. He didn't tell me to run for the car because he feared it might be someone trying to scare us out of the tent for reasons unknown. He whispered for me to go back to sleep, but I couldn't. Every small sound outside made me think someone was creeping up on us. After a while, when the noises had stopped for about 20 minutes, he told me to help him pack up quickly. He held our only weapon, a machete, close by while we packed under the bright moonlight, so we didn't need a flashlight. While we were hurrying to gather our things, I noticed an empty beer can near the cold campfire. It hadn't been there when we went to sleep around 10 p.m., and neither of us had brought beer on the trip. Thankfully, we got out of there. For the rest of the trip, we either camped in places with more people around or stayed in hotels. Whoever or whatever caused that strange noise, I'm just glad it wasn't us they were after.